how is it possible that a janitor with no college degree dies a millionaire, while a Harvard-educated banker ends up broke? That's not fiction. It's a real story. And it's exactly what today's episode of Grow Leap Academy is all about. We're breaking down The Psychology of Money by Morgan Housel, a book that reveals why financial success isn't about how smart you are, but how you behave when nobody's watching. This isn't another boring money talk. It's a raw look at the hidden patterns, emotions, and choices that shape your entire financial future, whether you realize it or not. So if you want to stop just knowing what to do with money and finally start doing it, let's dive in.
It's wild, right? You hear these stories about money, and they just completely flip your script.
Totally.
Like I was reading about this guy, Ronald Reed. He was a janitor, super frugal, lived a really simple life. And then there's this other guy, Richard Fuscone, Harvard MBA, big shot in finance, lived this lavish lifestyle.
Yeah.
And guess what? When they died, Reed, the janitor, left millions to charity. Fuscone. Foreclosure. I mean, how do you explain that? It can't just be luck, can it?
Well, right off the bat, that contrast really highlights something important. It shows that the things we typically associate with financial success, like a fancy degree or a high-powered job, don't always translate into long-term financial well-being.
Exactly. And that's what we're really diving into today, this whole idea of the psychology of money. So we're going to set aside all the complicated charts and formulas for a bit. We're taking a deep dive into this book, The Psychology of Money. It argues that how we behave with money often matters way more than what we know about it. And our goal today is to unearth the best stories and insights from this book to help you make sense of your own financial journey.
You know, it's so easy to feel overwhelmed by all the financial advice out there. It's like a constant fire hose.
Totally.
What truly matters, though, is understanding those core principles that lead to good financial decisions over the long run. And this isn't just about numbers. It's about understanding our own minds, our biases, and the wider world we're operating in. That's why we'll be exploring things like psychology and history aspects that might not seem directly related to your investment portfolio at first glance.
Right, because everyone approaches money with their own unique set of experiences, right? Think about it. Someone who grew up with very little money versus someone who never had to worry about it. They're going to see risk and reward in totally different ways.
Oh, yeah, sure.
And this book has some really interesting examples. Like, imagine the child of a wealthy banker compared to someone who grew up in real poverty, or someone who lived through crazy inflation, compared to someone who's only known stable prices. It's not about intelligence. It's about how your life has shaped your view of money.
You know, that's a crucial point. How much of what we think is our financial intuition is actually just a product of our personal history? There's this story in the book about John F. Kennedy who, despite being incredibly smart and educated, admitted that he never truly understood the Great Depression. His family's wealth shielded him from it. So his perspective was just fundamentally different because of his circumstances.
Yeah, and it's not just your upbringing, is it? The time and place you were born can have a huge impact on your financial path, and we often don't even realize it. This guy, Bill Gross, a legend in the bond market, even said that his success was largely due to the fact that interest rates were falling for most of his career. He was basically in the right place at the right time.
Right. And it's so important to understand how those large-scale trends intersect with individual experiences. The book does a great job of illustrating this with the example of people born in the 1970s versus the 1950s. Those born in the 70s, they saw the stock market boom during their formative years, right? So they probably see the market as the main way to build wealth. But for those born in the 50s, the picture was totally different.
It's like a completely different world, yeah.
And it's the same with inflation. Someone who grew up during the high inflation of the 60s will have a very different economic perspective than someone who came of age in the low inflation 90s.
Yeah, totally.
So what we learned from this is that our idea of what's normal in finance is deeply rooted in the economic environment we grew up in. And that's something completely outside of our control.
And it's not just those big economic shifts either, right?
Yeah.
The book also talks about the disparities in unemployment rates during the 2009 recession across different demographics, age, race, education level. It really shows you that the playing field isn't level no matter how hard you work. And then For a truly sobering thought experiment, think about the people in Germany and Japan during World War II. Their entire financial lives were just wiped out. Talk about an unexpected reset button. It really highlights the impact of circumstances.
Absolutely. And all of this understanding how our environment shapes our views, it helps explain why some financial behaviors that seem irrational on the surface actually make perfect sense when you consider the individual's experiences and their own story with money.
Yeah, and this is where it gets really interesting. So the book talks about this example of lottery tickets, right?
Okay.
And it's like, why do people with lower incomes often spend a bigger chunk of their money on something with such terrible odds, especially when they might not even have emergency savings?
Yeah.
What do you think is going on there?
It's a classic example that really throws traditional economists for a loop. You'd think that logically people would avoid those long odds.
Right.
But if you're someone who doesn't have a lot of economic opportunities, a lottery ticket might be their only shot, however small, at a life-changing event.
Oh, is
They're calculating the potential upside against a very limited downside, which is different from someone who has more financial security. So maybe it's less about not understanding probability and more about having a different perspective on what opportunities are available. It's a real aha moment, isn't it?
Yeah.
It makes you look beyond the surface logic. And the book also points out that a lot of the financial tools we take for granted, like 401ks and Roth IRAs, are actually pretty new. So it's not surprising that people struggle with retirement saving when the whole system is still relatively young.
Totally. So our financial behaviors are tied to our individual and collective experiences, and recognizing that is the first step towards making more conscious and less reactive financial decisions.
Right, that's a great point.
So we've talked about how our personal history and a little bit of luck can really shape our financial lives. But now let's dig into something that's often overlooked: the role of pure chance, both good and bad luck, in how things turn out financially. The book quotes this NYU professor, Scott Galloway, and he says, "Nothing is as good or as bad as it seems."
Yeah, I like that quote. It's so easy to fall into the trap of thinking that success is all about skill and failure is all about incompetence. But often, luck plays a huge role, and we don't even see it.
Right, and it's so true. Think about Bill Gates, right? Obviously, the guy's brilliant, but the book highlights this crazy stroke of luck he had.
Yeah.
He went to one of the only high schools in the world that had a computer back in 1968. The chances of that happening are astronomical.
It's incredible when you think about it.
Right. It's like for every Bill Gates, there's probably a Kent Evans out there, someone equally talented and driven who just didn't get that one lucky break.
Exactly.
Like a financial lottery in itself.
Yeah.
Even Robert Shiller, a Nobel Prize winner in economics, has said that he wants to understand the exact role of luck in successful outcomes.
And that brings up a really interesting point about how we interpret success and failure, both in ourselves and in others. Like the book says, we tend to blame other people's failures on their bad decisions, but when we fail, we blame bad luck.
It's funny how that works, isn't it?
Yeah. Right. We love those simple cause and effect stories, even when the reality is way more complex and involves a mix of skill, chance, and risk.
And honestly, the way financial news is presented doesn't help us much either, does it? They love to focus on those huge success stories, making these lucky people look like geniuses. And they often ignore the competent people who just happen to be on the wrong side of a risky bet. It can really distort your view of what actually leads to financial success.
You're absolutely right. And it's important to remember that the more extreme the outcome, the less likely those specific lessons are to apply to our own, more average lives. The stories of billionaires and people who lose everything, they often represent the extremes of luck and risk. It's much more valuable to look for broader patterns of success and failure.
Yeah, and sometimes it's hard to tell the difference, right? What looks like brilliant foresight in hindsight could have easily been a reckless gamble. The book even describes risk and luck as doppelgangers, and it's often only after the fact that we can tell them apart. And another thing the book stresses is that failure isn't always a good teacher, especially if we blame it entirely on bad decisions and ignore the role of risk. The key is to build a financial foundation that can handle those inevitable setbacks.
And this all comes back to the importance of being humble and realizing that we don't have as much control as we think we do. We have to appreciate the role of luck in the good times and the unforgiving nature of risk in the bad times.
Okay, so we've talked about luck, risk, and how our perceptions are shaped by our experiences. Now let's switch gears a bit and talk about this idea of enough. The book says that one of the hardest financial skills is knowing when you've reached a point where you're satisfied.
Oh, yeah, for sure.
It even gives this equation. Happiness equals results minus expectations. Pretty powerful when you think about it.
Yeah, that's a good one. Because it shows how easily our desires can grow as our income grows. If our expectations keep rising, we might end up always chasing more without ever feeling truly content.
And social comparison makes it even worse, right?
Absolutely.
The book gives this example of a rookie baseball player who makes $500,000 a year, but feels poor compared to his superstar teammate who has a multi-million-dollar contract.
Yeah, or even a guy like Mike Trout.
Right. Like he's making millions, but he's not even close to the wealthiest athletes. There's always someone with more.
Always, yeah.
And this constant comparison can make it really hard to define enough. And the book warns us that this relentless pursuit of more can lead to taking on too much risk and jeopardizing the things that truly matter, like your reputation, your freedom, your family.
Exactly.
The book tells the story of Rajat Gupta, a super successful businessman who went to prison for insider trading.
Oh, yeah, I remember that.
And after he got out, he said that all those things he was chasing, reputation, achievement, they meant nothing compared to what he lost. It's a powerful reminder that the pursuit of more can blind us to the point where we risk everything for gains that might not actually be worth it in the grand scheme of things.
Yeah, learning to recognize when you have enough is so crucial, but it's often overlooked.
Okay, so we've covered luck, risk, this idea of enough. Now, let's zoom out and take a long-term perspective. The book uses this analogy of ice ages, which is really fascinating.
Okay.
It talks about how these gradual, almost unnoticeable changes, like slightly cooler summers, can eventually lead to massive, dramatic changes over thousands of years. So how does this relate to our approach to money?
Well, it's a brilliant analogy for the power of compounding returns in investing. Just like those cooler summers gradually building up to an ice age, consistent, even if just okay returns, if left alone and allowed to compound over a long period of time, can create immense wealth. Warren Buffett is the perfect example.
Hey, he's the poster child for this.
Exactly. The book emphasizes how most of his wealth was actually built after he turned 50.
It's mind-blowing when you look at the numbers.
It really is.
The book calculates that if Buffett had started investing seriously in his 30s instead of his teens, his net worth would be 99.9% less than it is today.
Wow.
Of course, he's an incredible investor, but his real secret weapon is time. He understands the power of letting those returns compound over decades. It's not about hitting it big every year. It's about consistency.
Right, and solid long-term investing isn't about chasing the absolute highest returns because those are often unsustainable.
Yeah, those are the flashy headlines.
Exactly.
Eat
It's
it.
about finding those consistent returns that you can stick with for the long haul. And the book contrasts Buffett's steady approach with stories like Jesse Livermore.
Oh yeah, what happened with him again?
He was an investor who made and lost huge fortunes multiple times by chasing those unsustainable high returns. There's also the tragic story of Abraham Dramansky, who was ruined by the 1929 crash. These stories really drive home the importance of long-term survival in the market.
Okay, so how do we actually ensure that long-term survival in our investing?
Well, the book outlines a few key principles. First, the power of consistent, good returns over time. It's definitely not about getting rich quick. And that leads to the second principle. Having a margin of safety built into your financial plan.
What does that mean exactly?
It means having a buffer in your savings and your overall strategy. So if unexpected expenses come up or the market doesn't perform as well as you hoped, you're not completely derailed. It's about being resilient.
But that's different from being super conservative and missing out on potential growth, right?
Exactly. It's about increasing your odds of staying in the game long enough for those probabilities to work in your favor.
Okay, I get it.
And then the third element the book highlights is developing a barbelled personality.
What?
A barbelled personality. Basically, it means being optimistic about the long-term future and the potential for growth, while also being a little bit paranoid about the risks and pitfalls that could derail you.
So, like, hopeful but cautious.
Exactly. You can believe in long-term progress while still acknowledging that there will be uncertainty and setbacks along the way.
I like that. So it's like in biology and economics, where sometimes disruption or even destruction can actually pave the way for future growth.
Precisely. A lot of well-intentioned plans fail not because the underlying ideas were wrong, but because they needed everything to go perfectly right. That margin of safety gives you the resilience to handle the inevitable bumps in the road. Now, here's another fascinating concept from the book. Tails drive everything.
Tails drive everything. Okay, what does that mean?
It means that in many complex systems, including finance and business, a small number of extreme events or outcomes, what statisticians call the tails of the probability distribution, are responsible for the majority of the overall results.
Okay, I'm following so far.
So the book uses this example of Heinz Berggrun's art collection, where just a few of his pieces ended up being incredibly valuable, and those few pieces drove the success of his entire collection.
And this applies to other areas too, right?
Absolutely. It's a big part of venture capital, for example. Most startups fail, but a tiny percentage of huge successes generate most of the returns for the whole industry. And it even holds true for the stock market.
So most companies are just average, but a few big winners drive the whole market.
Exactly. In the long run, most companies in the stock market are either average performers or even failures. But a small handful of companies, think Amazon, Apple, with their huge transformative events, Prime, the iPhone, drive most of the market returns. It's remarkable. Even getting listed on an index like the Russell 3000 is a huge accomplishment for a company. But many of them still don't become those massive drivers of returns.
Okay, that makes sense.
So the key takeaway is not to try to pick every winner. It's about positioning yourself to benefit from those rare, massive successes when they happen.
And ride out the rest.
Exactly. And the book says that during times of chaos, a true investing genius is often someone who can just stay calm and avoid making rash decisions.
It's about being consistent even when things are crazy.
Precisely. When you understand that tails drive everything, you realize that failures and setbacks are just part of the process. The important thing is to endure through those tough times and stay invested so you can capture the gains from those occasional outsized successes that really make a difference over the long run.
And all of this leads to what the book calls the highest dividend money pays.
Yeah.
Control over your time. That really resonates with me.
Yeah, it's such an important point. It's about reframing our understanding of wealth. It's not just about having a big pile of money. It's about having the freedom and flexibility to live your life on your own terms.
The book shares the story of this guy, Derek Sivers, who achieved financial independence by living modestly and saving consistently, even though he didn't have a huge income.
Yeah.
And having control over his time allowed him to pursue his passion as a musician. That was priceless to him.
And the book contrasts this with a paradox we see a lot today. Rising incomes, bigger houses, but potentially less control over our time because of the demands of modern work. That feeling of constantly being on can undermine the very happiness we're hoping money will bring.
Right. We trade our time for money and then feel like we have no time to enjoy the money.
Exactly.
And the distinction the book makes between being rich, having a high income, and being truly wealthy, having accumulated assets, is so important. True wealth is often what you don't see.
Yeah.
And the book argues that increasing your savings rate often comes down to managing your ego and not caring what others think.
So true. It's about resisting that urge to keep up with the Joneses and instead focusing on what truly matters to you.
Okay, so we've talked about a lot today: luck, risk, the idea of enough, long-term thinking. And now the book takes us in another interesting direction. It suggests that in today's hyper-competitive world, intelligence alone isn't enough anymore.
Right. That's not the only factor.
What's becoming more important?
Well, in a world that's so interconnected and competitive, adaptability and flexibility become really crucial. Being able to adjust to new situations, change course when needed, and maintain control over your time and options, those incredibly valuable skills.
So it's not just about being smart. It's about being able to roll with the punches.
Exactly. And this leads to the idea of making reasonable decisions with your money as opposed to strictly rational decisions.
So what's the difference between reasonable and rational?
Well, traditional finance theory often focuses on finding the mathematically optimal strategy. But in real life, people tend to prefer strategies that give them peace of mind, even if they aren't technically perfect.
So it's like, what good is a perfect plan if it makes you too stressed out to stick with it?
Precisely. The book gives this example of highly leveraged retirement accounts.
Oh yeah, those can be risky.
Right. On paper, they might offer the potential for higher returns. But the emotional stress of big market swings could lead people to abandon the strategy at the worst possible time.
So it's about finding that sweet spot between potential gains and being able to sleep at night.
Exactly. The book even suggests that loving your investments can be a good strategy for long-term commitment.
How do you love an investment?
Well, if you're genuinely interested in understand what you own, you're more likely to stay the course when the market gets bumpy. It's about having conviction in your choices.
Yeah, that makes sense.
And the book also cautions against relying too heavily on past performance to predict future returns because market conditions are always changing.
Past performance is not indicative of future results, they always say.
Right. The book argues that studying the history of money is more useful for understanding human behavior, greed, fear, than it is for predicting specific trends. And speaking of understanding human behavior, the book brings us full circle with this crucial idea of room for error. It uses this analogy of blackjack card counting, which is really interesting.
Okay, how does that work?
So even if you have a statistical advantage in blackjack, if you bet too much, you can still lose everything.
So it's not just about having an edge, it's about managing your risk.
Exactly. There's never a time when you should bet everything. Building in that margin of safety acknowledges the inherent uncertainty of the world, and it dramatically increases your chances of surviving over the long term. The book talks about how Bill Gates was actually quite conservative with Microsoft's finances early on. That's a great example of this principle in action.
Yeah, it makes sense. He wasn't taking unnecessary risks.
Right. It's about creating a buffer between your theoretical ability to handle financial hardship and your actual emotional capacity to deal with market downturn.
Because those are two very different things.
Exactly. And the book wisely warns about the dangers of using too much leverage.
Which is basically borrowing money to invest, right?
Right. Leverage can turn normal market risks into huge losses. The book even tells this funny story about German tanks being disabled by mice.
Mice.
Yeah. It highlights those unknown unknowns, the things you can't even predict. And the point is that you need to avoid having single points of failure in your financial life. Always keep some savings for those unexpected events, like the financial equivalent of those mice.
So you're saying even the best laid plans can go wrong.
That's exactly what the book says. The most crucial part of any financial plan is anticipating that it won't go exactly as planned.
I love that. So as we wrap up this deep dive into the psychology of money, it's clear that financial well-being isn't just about understanding the numbers. It's about understanding ourselves, our biases, our history, and the role of luck and risk.
Absolutely.
The book reminds us that no one is crazy when it comes to their financial decisions. We all have our own reasons and perspectives. The real power is understanding the forces that shape our choices and building in that room for error. It really makes you think about your own financial psychology, doesn't it?
Definitely. It's all about taking a step back and looking at the bigger picture.
By making decisions that will help us not just survive, but thrive in the long run.
Absolutely.
Well, on that note, thanks for joining us for this deep dive. We hope it's given you some food for thought and some new tools to navigate your own financial journey.
Yeah, thanks for having me. This was a great conversation.
And to our listeners, keep exploring, keep learning, and keep that long-term perspective in mind. Until next time.
See you next time.
Thank you for listening. If this episode resonated with you, the best way to support the podcast is to hit like, subscribe to the channel, and share it with someone who needs to hear it. Every bit of support helps us keep creating content that actually matters. See you in the next one.